and we reestablished diplomatic relations with the Europeans, right? We talked about how we had a lot of foreign investment and there was a lot of foreign capital in our country. And as we said last class, perhaps it was a little bit too much, right? Can you go to the next one? Next one, yes. So we're going to talk about this first stage of the revolution, which I don't recall if we talked about last class, but I guess we did a little bit. So the first stage of the revolution, as you guys know, this was a social outburst and a social outcry for social justice. However, the revolution had a lot of different factions and a lot of different groups that were actually fighting for different things. You had on the one side, you had the groups that were the group that was not, they didn't like the political system, so they wanted to change the political system. Then you had the northern ones that were preoccupied about the mining issues, the labor conditions, and then you had the southern groups who were worried about the agricultural sector and the land, and they wanted some social justice, for the lands. And basically what this meant was that the factions of the Mexican Revolution were destined to divide after Porfirio Diaz left the country, which actually happened just a year later, if you guys remember. And so all these factions started to go against each other, so that then we have this social movement that instead of lasting 1 year, which is the time that took Porfirio Diaz to leave the country, it took 10 years from 1910 to 1920. So before the revolution, as you guys know, most of the population was really poor. It was uneducated, it was unattended, illiterate, and most of them lived in rural areas. So only 8% of the population was considered middle class, which is like really low, and only 1% concentrated most of the wealth in the country. So there was a lot of instability inside the country. Now, if we think about what we have learned conceptually about foreign policy, we would think that these internal conditions, right, these internal factors, as we discussed when talking about the factors of foreign policy, like these internal factors should have been enough to have a foreign policy that would allow the population of Mexico to develop. However, that didn't happen. So we can say that a lot of the decisions that were made during Porfiriato regarding foreign policy, most of the decisions were not necessarily based on the national interest, but on group interest. A lot of people would debate this because in the end, like the final results of Porfiriato, as we can read in every single history book, is that there was a lot of economic growth and there was development in the cities, right? Especially Mexico City. And it seemed to be this golden age of economic growth in our society. However, if we take into account that most of this society was marginalized, then we cannot say that they had, like Porfirio didn't have a foreign policy that was based on foreign policy, on national interest, but on group interest. And so the first stage of the revolution, try to fight this. But it was hard to change or to shift, like the tendency that we had of having a foreign policy that was based on group interests. Because as we will see, and I think we discussed that a little bit last class, even though changes were made to the constitutions, those changes could not be implemented immediately because of interest groups. And so that kept Mexican foreign policy to actually be from being a policy that was based on national interest. That didn't happen until more almost the second half of the 20th century. Can you go to the next slide, Susana, please? Hello. Doesn't move?
Wait.
Thank you. Okay. We talked about Madero last class, right? And as we discussed last class, he didn't have enough time to unfold Mexican foreign policy. He didn't have enough time to be a president. He attempted to solve the issue of El Chamizal. El Chamizal is a piece of land, okay, that is located in Chihuahua, in the border in Chihuahua. And basically what happened is that the natural border was supposed to be the river, right? Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. It was supposed to be the natural border. However, because of some changes in the region, the river moved. And so there was a lot of pressure, like a lot of land that was supposed to be on Mexico ended up being on the U.S. in the U.S. And this became a legal issue that lasted about 100 years. This issue was actually solved until the 1960s, more or less. And it's always really interesting to talk about Chamizal because it was one of the first international legal issues that were solved through arbitraje internacional, international arbitration. And El Chamizal is a book example, about when talking about international law. If you ever go to Ciudad Juarez, yes, it's Juarez. If you ever go to Ciudad Juarez, you will see that they even have a museum about El Chamizal, and that a lot of territory that was part of the Chamizal, it became a public park, and you see people running around and everything. I mean, it's really interesting to go and see that museum. Madero also imposed taxes on all exports. I think we did discuss this last class. This bothered foreign investors, and then he received a lot of pressure from American diplomats. So there was a point in which Madero was not necessarily approved by the Americans. So it is thought that the Americans collaborated in a complot to assassinate Madero during the period of time that is known as Decena Trágica, which we will not go over Decena Trágica because you guys are supposed to know this. But yeah, so it was supposedly a complot between Victoriano Huerta and the American diplomat at the time. Okay. So I do have a video right there, Susana. If you would please help me and share that video. I think that the video is about El Chamizal. So in the meantime, while Susana helps me with the video, you guys, do you have any question or comment that you would like to make? Paulina, I see your hand is up, but I don't know if you want to question something or...
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
It's fine. Okay. Ah, yeah, it's Madero. So let's watch this video. Thank you, Susana.
Francisco I. Madero nació en 1873 en Parras, Coahuila, en el seno de una de las familias más ricas e importantes del norte de México. En París, donde realizó estudios de peritaje mercantil, descubrió a los 18 años el espiritismo, que asumió desde entonces como su guía ética. Guiado por los consejos de los espíritus con los que creía comunicarse, entre ellos el de Benito Juárez, decidió en 1904 incursionar en la política oponiéndose a la reelección del gobernador Miguel Cárdenas. La labor política de Madero se fortaleció en el ámbito estatal y comenzó a establecer comunicación con otros opositores al régimen del general Porfirio Díaz, como Ricardo Flores Magón, a quien le ayudó a financiar por un tiempo su periódico Regeneración. Con calma y cuidado, Madero empezó a trazar un plan político minucioso. Apoyado en sus creencias espiritistas, se sentía predestinado para darle libertad al pueblo. Tras la entrevista a Díaz-Krillman, en la que Díaz afirmó que después de 3 décadas en el poder no participaría en las elecciones de 1910, Madero dio el paso siguiente en su plan. Escribió un libro, La sucesión presidencial. Madero diagnosticaba los males de México, el poder absoluto, el militarismo, el desinterés del gobierno por las necesidades del pueblo y propuso su solución con democracia. Madero planteó limitar al poder y volver a la práctica de la Constitución de 1857. Su lema fue libertad y sufragio, no reelección. Madero no quería derrocar al gobierno de manera violenta, sino que deseaba una transición pacífica, decidida por las urnas electorales. Pero su visión cambió al conocer personalmente a Porfirio Díaz. Se dio cuenta entonces de que aquel hombre no cedería el poder y solo una revolución armada terminaría con la dictadura. Para preocupación de Porfirio Díaz y sus seguidores, el ascenso del antirreeleccionismo encabezado por aquel hombre al que llamaban loco era vertiginoso. Comenzó entonces la represión contra los maderistas y el propio Madero fue detenido en Monterrey, acusado de conato de rebelión y trasladado al penal de San Luis Potosí. En la cárcel recibió noticias del triunfo fraudulento de Díaz en las elecciones y escribió, con la colaboración del poeta Ramón López Velarde, su manifiesto, El Plan de San Luis, que convocaba a una sublevación con fecha precisa, el 20 de noviembre de 1910. Madero consiguió escapar de la prisión y ya en territorio estadounidense publicó su plan. Llegada la fecha señalada, entró de nuevo a México. Aunque no lo sabía, poco a poco comenzaron a aparecer focos de insurrección, especialmente en el norte del país. En febrero de 1911, atacó la ciudad de Casas Grandes, donde resultó herido levemente. Las batallas se multiplicaron con importantes triunfos para los revolucionarios y a principios de mayo consiguieron tomar la fronteriza Ciudad Juárez. Este hecho señaló el momento en que la dictadura de Díaz cedió, y el día 21 de ese mismo mes se firmaron entre gobierno y rebeldes los tratados de Ciudad Juárez. Como se estableció en ellos, Porfirio Díaz renunció unos días más tarde y partió al exilio. El 7 de junio de ese mismo año, Madero hizo su entrada triunfal a la Ciudad de México, donde lo aclamaron 100,000 personas. Pero el vencedor había decidido no acceder al poder por las armas. Permitió que se estableciera un gobierno interino, encabezado por el porfirista Francisco León de la Barra, y accedió al licenciamiento y desarme de las tropas que le habían dado el triunfo. Ambos resultarían graves errores. El presidente interino León de la Barra se esmeró en enemistar a Madero con otros jefes revolucionarios, como Emiliano Zapata y Pascual Orozco. Madero intentó mediar, pero los antiguos rebeldes no entendían por qué debían esperar para satisfacer sus demandas. En noviembre de 1911, tras unas elecciones ejemplares, las más democráticas de la historia de México, Madero finalmente llegó a la presidencia. Pero su alianza con otros revolucionarios se había socavado, y casi enseguida Zapata lanzó el Plan de Ayala y se rebeló en su contra. El gobierno de Madero duraría apenas 15 meses, que transcurrieron bajo la oposición del Senado y la Suprema Corte de Justicia, y la animadversión del embajador de Estados Unidos, Henry Lane Wilson. Incluso la prensa, que había despertado apenas a la libertad de expresión, encontró en Madero el principal blanco de sus ataques, caricaturas y burlas. Su hermano Gustavo afirmaba que la prensa muerde la mano que le ha quitado el bozal. Pese a todo, durante el gobierno maderista hubo avances importantes en el ejercicio de las libertades, construcción de caminos y carreteras, y en la pluralidad legislativa, con una Cámara de Diputados electa libremente. No obstante, la prensa alentó un sentimiento continuo de agitación en la población ambiente favorable para el golpe militar en su contra que estalló el 9 de febrero de 1913. Durante 10 días, a los que se les conoce como la Decena Trágica, el gobierno combatió a los militares rebeldes, teniendo como campo de batalla a la propia Ciudad de México, que sufrió grandes destrozos. Félix Díaz y Manuel Mondragón, que encabezaban el ataque, se refugiaron en el edificio de la Ciudadela. Madero entregó el mando de la plaza al general Victoriano Huerta, quien se había distinguido en el combate a los orozquistas, para que se enfrentara a los sublevados. Pero Huerta tenía su propio plan, y pronto entró en comunicación con Díaz y Mondragón. Sus ataques a la Ciudadela comenzaron a ser sospechosamente poco certeros, y al mismo tiempo sacrificó soldados leales a Madero. El 17 de febrero, mientras continuaban el bombardeo de la ciudad, Gustavo Amadero, el hermano del presidente, descubrió que Huerta estaba coludido con Félix Díaz y Mondragón y lo arrestó personalmente. Llevado frente a Madero, Huerta juró su inocencia y prometió ayudar al presidente a restablecer la paz. Madero tomó una decisión suicida. Le devolvió su pistola a Huerta y le confirmó el mando. Huerta consumó entonces su traición. El día 18, Madero fue hecho prisionero después de la balacera en el Palacio Nacional. Mientras tanto, Huerta invitó a comer a Gustavo y lo aprendió. Ese mismo día, el hermano del presidente fue asesinado cobarde y brutalmente en la Ciudadela, después de haberlo dejado ciego. Madero y su vicepresidente, José María Pino Suárez, fueron obligados a renunciar el 19 de febrero. Pedro Lascurain, su sucesor, fue presidente por apenas 45 minutos antes de dimitir a favor de Victoriano Huerta. Aunque se le había prometido enviarlo al exilio en Cuba la noche del 22 de febrero, mientras se le trasladaba con Pino Suárez a la penitenciaría de Lecumberri, el mayor Cárdenas, encargado de su custodia, lo asesinó con su pistola. El día siguiente, el gobierno de Victoriano Huerta afirmó que Madero había muerto en la balacera que siguió a un intento de rescate por parte de sus partidarios.
Thank you, Susana. So that's a little bit of a background for Madero and how he ended up being betrayed by Victoriano Huerta. As you guys could hear on the video, the American diplomat was not, the American ambassador was not very fond of Madero, and there were a lot of suspicions as well. Basically because he seemed like a weak president, like he could not have stability within the country. And remember that stability is always important for the Americans since it affects their economic interests. And so the diplomat, the American ambassador was not very fond of Madero. And it is said that he supported Victoriano Huerta in his betrayal of Madero. Can you go to the next slide, please? We talked about Venustiano Carranza. I'm sorry. We talked about how he came up with Doctrina Carranza. He faced the diplomatic crisis after Villa invaded Columbus, New Mexico. We know that Villa became this criminal that was wanted in the US for a lot of millions of dollars. He allowed an expedition into Mexico, an American expedition to look for Francisco Villa, but it ended immediately in 1917 because the US suddenly focused on what was going on the other side of the Atlantic, which was the First World War. And he came up with the Constitution of 1917. We already talked about, if I recall correctly, we talked about these articles, Article 27, 33, and 123. And we know that Article 27 was especially that article that bothered international foreign investors, right? Can you go to the next slide? I'm gonna leave the videos right there if you would like to watch them later, and if we have time, we can watch them. So Carranza doctrine, we talked about this, as I recall as well. We said that this, like the basic principles of Carranza doctrine was non-intervention, the self-determination of peoples. Now these things are very in trend at the time, this self-determination of peoples. it actually, this concept of the self-determination is also mentioned in the Woodrow Wilson 14 points after First World War. We talk, well, there's the legal equality of nations, which has to do with international law and the concept of sovereignty as well, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. The legal equality of nations is a principle that still today is part of Mexican foreign policy. And it basically bets for like the equality of all of the countries, regardless of their amount of power, whether it's economic power or political power or military power. It just defends like sovereignty as a principle that will allow every single state to be the same before international law. So those are the main principles for the Carranza Doctrine. I'm not going to go too much over them because we talked about it last class. Can you go to the next slide, please? There's a timeline. You can find this timeline in the book that I uploaded onto Teams. Basically, is how the first stage of the revolution developed and what was going on in the international system at the time that Mexico was going through this social movement because of the revolution. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we're going to go to the second stage of the Mexican Revolution. All of the governments that came after Venustiano Carranza, up until basically Lázaro Cárdenas, all of them will be known as gobiernos revolucionarios. No, those are the ones that are defending the revolution. So after Plan de Agua Prieta, we know that Carranza was assassinated and that Álvaro Obregón took the leadership. He faced many challenges regarding the U.S. because the U.S. was not happy about the instability that was happening in Mexico. So Obregón was desperately looking for U.S. recognition, especially because this was seen as a coup d'etat, and the U.S. refused initially to recognize Obregón's government. However, they eventually did recognize Obregón because he yielded, some agreements that became important for the Mexican-American relationship. One of them was the Huerta-Lamont Agreement, which was, in general terms, that was an agreement about the external debt that Mexico had with the U.S. that had been affected because of all of the conflict during the Mexican Revolution. So there was a renegotiation of that debt that benefited the U.S. And so the U.S. kind of felt a little bit, less conflicted about Mexico when the Huerta-Lamont Agreement was signed. And then we have the famous Tratados de Bucareli, which we will discuss a little bit deeper later. But basically, Bucareli is seen as a treaty that will allow American intervention in certain Mexican issues, right? We will talk about Tratados de Bucareli. And these two important agreements allowed the U.S. to increase their trust in Obregón, and so they finally gave Obregón their recognition as a legitimate government in Mexico. Can you go to the next slide, please? I'm sorry, it says should say pragmatism, okay? So what happened is that with Álvaro Obregón, we can say that the foreign policy was very pragmatic. Obregón was interested in having the U.S. recognition, and so through these two agreements that I just mentioned, they got it, even though those agreements are not seen as beneficial to Mexico. At the time, they were needed for U.S. recognition. Otherwise, if the Mexico wouldn't have gotten the recognition of the most important neighbor to the north, in the north. So yeah, so they, theories see this decision, this Obregón's decision as being pragmatic, as something that was needed at the time to get the U.S. recognition. It is also, Obregón's office or administration is also considered to have ended Mexico's isolationism from the world. After the Mexican Revolution, with Doctrina Carranza and with everything that was going on domestically, Mexico was entirely focused on what was going on inside. And with Álvaro Obregón, it seemed like Mexico ended this isolationism and was worried about becoming part again of the international system. Obregón increased Mexico's relations with the European countries, which in the beginning would seem as something that the Americans would not like. As you guys know, the Americans were trying to keep the Europeans out of the continent at all costs. And however, with the treaties that had been previously signed, okay, with the Huerta Lamont and the Bucareli treaties, it seemed like the U.S. felt at ease with what was doing, with what Mexico was doing regarding its international relations, especially because when Obregón increased relations with the European countries, it did include the Soviet Union. And for many analysts of Mexican foreign policy, this was an important move by Obregón because it kind of like, manifested the country's autonomy regarding foreign policy. However, we can say that Obregón did have that, in Spanish, we would say like that colchón, like, okay, so I'm gonna do something that the US may not like. However, I already gave them a guarantee of our good relations, which were the previous two agreements that we discussed before. And we are going to see how Obregón and then the latter presidents, even Lázaro Cárdenas, okay, they did these kind of things, like they would deal certain things to the US, and then they felt a little bit more like free to have an autonomous foreign policy because the US would go with it, right? Or would not, be too conflicted about it, because the interests that laid in the relationship were much bigger than having an influence of Mexican foreign policy regarding, for example, socialist countries. We know, for example, that Mexico has always had, at least throughout the whole 20th century, a good relationship with Cuba and with other socialist regimes that were important in Latin America. So even though Obregón did increase the relations with the European countries and the Soviet Union, the US kept being a fundamental element of Obregón's foreign policy. We discussed this in the first 2 weeks of class. We know that the US will always be a fundamental element of Mexican foreign policy. However, in this case, at the time, because of these pragmatic decisions and also because Obregón protected certain economic interests, we can say that the foreign policy was based on group interests instead of national interest. It was very pragmatic because it renounced the country's sovereignty somehow in order to achieve the US recognition through these two agreements that we discussed. Okay, we are going to, that video that's in there, I would like us to watch. It's about Obregón, and it does mention these tensions with the US. So while Susana helps me with the video, we can summarize that Obregón's foreign policy was very pragmatic and it was based in group interest. A lot of people argue that it was needed, that it would not have been very smart at the time to refuse the treaties, this Huerta Lamont and Bucareli Treaty, because the US was much more stable and much more powerful than Mexico was. So thank you. Please go ahead with the video, Susana.
Álvaro Obregón nació en la hacienda de Siquicima, Sonora, en 1880. Su familia, antes medianamente rica, estaba casi en quiebra cuando él llegó al mundo. Su padre murió poco tiempo después de que él naciera, dejando en la orfandad a sus 18 hijos. Álvaro fue un niño que no habló hasta los 5 años, pero que mostró después increíbles facultades de memoria e inventiva. Desde 1898, Obregón se dedicó a la agricultura con poco éxito. Pese a ello, en 1906 logró comprar una finca, a la que nombró La Quinta Chilla, y comenzó un periodo de bonanza económica al que ensombreció la desgracia familiar. Su esposa, Refugio Urrea, murió en el parto de unos gemelos que también fallecieron. Para entonces, Obregón había procreado ya otros 2 hijos. La lucha democrática y después revolucionaria de Francisco I. Madero fue vista con indiferencia por Álvaro Obregón. A nadie se le ocultaba que sentía incluso simpatía por Porfirio Díaz. Sin embargo, tras la caída del dictador, su hermano José fue nombrado alcalde interino de Huatabampo y Álvaro decidió contender en las elecciones que se celebraron el mes de septiembre. Con el apoyo de los yaquis, Álvaro resultó electo. El golpe de Estado contra el presidente Francisco I. Madero y su asesinato despertaron una ola de indignación en el país. Pese a ello, solo los gobernadores de Coahuila y Sonora desconocieron al gobierno usurpador de Victoriano Huerta. El 26 de marzo de 1913 fue proclamado el Plan de Guadalupe, alrededor del cual los revolucionarios del norte organizaron la lucha conformando el Ejército Constitucionalista. Álvaro Obregón recibió el nombramiento de jefe militar de Hermosillo. En una serie de batallas exitosas, las tropas constitucionalistas de Sonora capturaron Guaymas, Cananea y Naco, tomando prácticamente el control del territorio estatal. Eso permitió que Venustiano Carranza estableciera su gobierno en Hermosillo. En septiembre, Carranza designó a Obregón comandante del Ejército del Noroeste, uno de los 3 cuerpos con los que el ejército constitucionalista preparaba su avance hacia la capital del país. A partir de mayo de 1914, Obregón inició su avance decidido hacia el sur, tomando Tepic y la importantísima Guadalajara. Ahí tuvo noticias del formidable avance paralelo de la División del Norte comandada por Pancho Villa, que en Zacatecas había significado una de las batallas más sangrientas de la guerra, en que se decidió la suerte de Victoriano Huerta. El recelo de Carranza hacia Pancho Villa motivó que, pese a sus victorias, ordenara su regreso hacia Chihuahua, mientras Obregón, ya convertido en general de división, enfilaba hacia la Ciudad de México, a la que entró victorioso en agosto de 1914. Lleno de remordimientos por no haber participado desde el principio en la revolución, visitó la tumba de Madero y decidió tomar venganza de todos quienes no lo apoyaron en los días aciagos de la decena trágica. Fijó impuestos de guerra a los propietarios, a los comerciantes y al clero, persiguió a los acaparadores e incluso encarceló a algunos abarroteros españoles, a quienes hizo también barrer las calles. Obregón tuvo un lugar destacado en las sesiones de la Convención de Aguascalientes, pero se mostró ambiguo entre el apoyo a Carranza y las decisiones de esta junta, que lo removió del poder ejecutivo. Cuando vino el rompimiento, se adhirió al carrancismo y se convirtió en la más importante pieza militar en su lucha contra zapatistas y villistas. Las fuerzas convencionistas y carrancistas se enfrentaron en una serie de cruentas batallas en la zona del Bajío en abril de 1915. Una y otra vez, los ataques frontales de la caballería villista se estrellaron contra la artillería de Obregón, Sin embargo, el 15 de abril se alzó con la victoria, y los últimos restos de la División del Norte se retiraron desordenadamente. Unos meses después, cuando Obregón perseguía a las dispersas guerrillas villistas, sus tropas fueron atacadas con granadas. En el ataque, perdió el brazo derecho y al verse en ese estado intentó suicidarse. Apretó el gatillo, pero el arma no disparó y le fue arrebatada antes de que lo intentara nuevamente. En 1916, Obregón era visto como el caudillo invicto de la revolución, a quien no le faltaba ni siquiera la visible cicatriz de la guerra. Regresó a Sonora, a la Quinta Chilla, donde construyó un pequeño emporio agrícola que dio trabajo a 1,500 personas. La amputación de su brazo había cambiado su metabolismo y el regreso a la vida civil lo cambió radicalmente. Obregón engordó y encaneció. 5 años después de su mutilación, a los 40, parecía ya un hombre viejo. Aunque Obregón disfrutó el regreso a los trabajos agrícolas, desde la Quinta Chilla miraba la silla presidencial. Esperaba, por supuesto, que Carranza correspondiera a la lealtad que él le había profesado durante la guerra. Pero Carranza tenía otras ideas. Comprendía la amenaza del militarismo y postuló a un civil, Ignacio Bonillas, como su sucesor para las elecciones de 1920. Obregón, despechado, se lanzó como candidato opositor. En cuestión de meses, el caudillo invicto atrajo grupos, pactó compromisos, todo con el fin de alcanzar el poder. Mientras tanto, sus aliados Plutarco Elías Calles y Adolfo de la Huerta habían lanzado en Sonora el plan de Agua Prieta, que desconocía a Carranza. Muy pronto, casi todos los generales se adhirieron al plan, dejando solo al presidente. Carranza se vio obligado a salir de la capital rumbo a Veracruz. En el camino, murió durante un ataque a traición, en condiciones inciertas. El 1 de diciembre de 1920, Álvaro Obregón se convirtió en presidente de México. Durante su gobierno, creó la Secretaría de Educación Pública y designó como su titular a José Vasconcelos. Gracias a él, la cultura mexicana tuvo un renacimiento que abarcó desde la fundación de escuelas rurales hasta la realización de grandes obras de pintura mural en los edificios públicos. En 1923, al aproximarse la sucesión presidencial, Obregón apoyó a Plutarco Elías Calles como candidato, con miras ya a reelegirse en 1928. Esto provocó la rebelión de Adolfo de la Huerta y cerca de la mitad del ejército apoyó su sublevación. Obregón logró vencer a los rebeldes, pero la revuelta dejó un doloroso saldo de 7,000 muertos. Cuando Calles se convirtió en presidente, Álvaro Obregón volvió a sus tierras a construir, esta vez no un emporio, sino un verdadero imperio. Pero desde allá ambicionaba volver a la presidencia y finalmente logró en 1927 que el Congreso restableciera la reelección presidencial. Durante su campaña, sus enemigos, los generales Arnulfo R. Gómez y Francisco R. Serrano, conspiraron para detenerlo y fusilarlo. Descubierto el complot, Serrano fue detenido, pero en lugar de encarcelársele y seguírsele un juicio, fue asesinado con varios seguidores en Huitzilac. Obregón sufrió también un ataque con una bomba lanzada hacia su auto cuando se dirigía a una corrida de toros. Entonces fue cuando declaró: viviré hasta que alguien esté dispuesto a cambiar su vida por la mía. El 17 de julio de 1928, cuando se había convertido ya en presidente electo, llegó ese alguien. En el restaurante La Bombilla de San Ángel, José de León Toral se acercó con el pretexto de mostrarle una caricatura que le había hecho. Ahí sacó su pistola y le disparó 6 tiros.
Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me right there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Can you skip that, Susana? Because we are not gonna do that right now. Excellent. So there was a little bit of a background of Álvaro Obregón. I'm gonna go through the next slides because I wanna finish with this before tomorrow. Because tomorrow we have an activity, okay? So I'm gonna go to Plutarco Elías Calles. So Plutarco Elias Calles, as you guys know, he is one of the most important presidents. I mean, all of them are, but what I mean is that Plutarco Elias Calles became a really influential political figure throughout a period of time known as El Maximato. He established diplomatic relations with the UK in 1925. The UK were very angry with Mexico because of certain policies, especially the Article 27 and some other policies regarding oil, and their interests were very affected during the Mexican Revolution, and then some with some other policies that were implemented later. And so Plutarco Elias Calles managed to reestablish relations with the UK. There was tension with the US due to new laws that affected American oil companies as well, and the US was about to intervene, but negotiations were successful. Many presidents tried to implement what was said in Article 27, and every time they tried, they had tensions, whether it was with the UK or with the US. This was a period of time in which American intervention seemed really, really close because of Elias Calles trying to implement or to enforce the Article 27 of the Constitution of 1917. There was, as I was saying, there was a lot of tensions with the US at the time. There was some domestic instability as well because of the tensions that were created with the US, and he couldn't achieve that enforcement of Article 27. Actually, the activity that we are going to have tomorrow have to do precisely with all of the agreements and what surrounded the enforcement of Article 27, because every time, like, US intervention was there every time that they tried to enforce. The only one that managed to enforce Article 27 fully was Lázaro Cárdenas, and this happened until 1938, as you guys know, with the expropiación petrolera. But before that, it was really difficult for the Mexican presidents to enforce this for various reasons, especially because internal factors were usually not favorable for the Mexican presidents to enforce the article, and also Mexico's position as an economic power and as a political power in the world was not necessarily the best. And so it was really hard for the Mexican presidents to enforce the Constitution fully, at least regarding the national resources in the investment that the foreigners had in our territory. Can you go to the next slide, please? So there was a relative calm during Maximato, as you guys know. But this relative calm had to do with control, or the control that Calles had over the political system in our country. This Maximato period was from 1928 to 1934, before Lázaro Cárdenas. There was this renegotiation of the debt that came since the Huerta-Lamont first agreement. This new renegotiation of debt was called Montes de Oca-Lamont agreement, okay? It's also characterized, as we talked last class, because Mexico was part of the League of Nations, and it's also characterized, one of the most important things that happened during Maximato was the emergence of the Doctrina Estrada, or the Estrada Doctrine, by 1930, which is basically influenced by the first Doctrina Carranza that we had. I left the text in Spanish so you guys can see exactly what it says. I don't know what happened. Okay. El gobierno, as you guys can see, right? Basically, again, this has to do with keeping Mexico outside of everybody's business. It says, el gobierno de México se limita a mantener o retirar cuando lo crea procedente a sus agentes diplomáticos y a continuar aceptando cuando también lo considere procedente a los similares agentes diplomáticos que las naciones respectivas tengan acreditados en México, sin calificar ni precipitadamente ni a posteriori el derecho que tengan las naciones extranjeras para mantener o sustituir a sus gobiernos o autoridades. These at the time, you guys know that there was a lot of unrest in Europe for what was going on that led to the Second World War. There was a lot of tension as well because of the 1929 crisis, and what Doctrina Estrada basically did, although it doesn't mention it directly, is what it basically did was to emphasize sovereignty again and the right of the countries to adopt any type of political system that they wanted. Doctrina Estrada is still used in Mexican foreign policy. A lot of contemporary theories say that Doctrina Estrada is outdated, that it should be, you know, like left behind, that it doesn't respond to the current needs for Mexico in the international system. However, there's still a lot of people who defend Doctrina Estrada because it has been effective throughout the years for Mexico, especially because it has kept other powers such as the US from having a more direct intervention in Mexican foreign policy. We cannot say that they have not intervened or influenced Mexican foreign policy somehow, because that would be being too innocent, right? However, it has limited the intervention of other powers in Mexican foreign policy. Can you go to the next slide, Susie, please? Okay, so it's okay. Great. So next class, the team who is going to start presenting is going to start with Lázaro Cárdenas, if I'm correct, right? Is the team aware that they start next class? Are you guys? Who is the team? No. Who is the team who's presenting? Daniel, Emiliano, Rebeca, Osvaldo, Maria Fernanda, Paola, and Mariana Isabel. You guys. You begin next week with Lázaro Cárdenas, okay? So please be aware of that. Are you guys here? Because no one is responding.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you guys, so we basically went over some details that we discussed last class. As I said, tomorrow we're gonna do an activity about Tratados de Bucareli and their impact, okay? And how it was so hard to emphasize and, to enforce Article 27, and then we will start with Lázaro Cárdenas. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on anything, or if you have any question, you guys. Yes, Mariana, go ahead.
Yes, teacher. In the video, they were saying, if I don't remember well, that Madero didn't manage pretty well the government, and you said it too. But my question is, if he wasn't able to manage the government, or it was all because all these people that were against him, because I don't remember who was the one that he didn't want Madero in the power, so he carried that people to get against Madero, or it was himself, Madero, that couldn't manage himself the government?
Yes. I think that's a tricky question, but I'm going to try to answer it. I think it was both. I think Madero was very, very an idealist. And I think that he overlooked the necessity of having much more control over the government and the territory, because you have to remember that they were just coming out of an armed conflict, okay? And as I said before, this first stage, like this first year, the objective of all the groups was to overthrow Porfirio Diaz, and they did it by 1911. And so once they achieved that purpose, every single group of the revolution kind of like fell apart, in the sense that they not fell apart. They started pursuing their own interests, okay? And so Madero could not achieve unity. He could not achieve cohesion with, like, in the country, okay? And that played against him. And I think he was too idealist as well. I think he was a little bit innocent to believe that the political groups that were in power at the time, I think he was very innocent to think that they were going to go along with his democratic ideals. He also lost support from the Americans and from certain elite groups because he wanted to tax oil exports, and that affected the price of oil outside, and so it affected American interests. And I think that his lack of ability to build unity, okay, after Porfirio Diaz left and he was elected president, that's what played against him. And also the lack of support from the Americans. So I think that it was both, Mariana. I think that he could have been a little bit tougher on certain things, on certain groups, and it was not the moment, in my opinion, and also some authors talk about it, like it was not the moment to maybe it was not the moment to affect American interests, in oil. Also, the fact that he couldn't achieve political unity and he couldn't achieve political stability and security in the country